Hello, and welcome to today's conversation, The State of Innovation. I'm Bennett Richardson, President of Protocol. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our partners at Qualcomm for making today's event possible. At Protocol, we aim to arm you as leaders and decision makers in technology, business, and policy with actionable news and analysis to help you do your job. The global innovation race is well underway. What is the US administration doing to stay ahead, and where is it falling short? What is the status of funding by Congress and in state houses, and in which areas still need investment? Is the US doing enough to attract and retain top tech talent from around the world? And let's obviously not forget about China. In this event, we'll dive into the US's national strategy on innovation, what's working, what isn't, and what policy changes we can expect from the year ahead. We're so glad you could tune in today. If you're not already subscribed, don't forget to sign up for Protocol Policy and Protocol's entire family of newsletters at protocol.com/newsletters. To kick things off, I'm excited to welcome John Smee for an executive conversation on U.S. tech innovation. John is the Senior Vice President of Engineering at Qualcomm, where he is the 5G R&D lead, responsible for overseeing all 5G research projects, including end-to-end system design and advanced prototype implementation in Qualcomm's Wireless Research and Development Group. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
Of course. So to kick off our conversation today, can you give us some context on what we're seeing in the global landscape of the development of advanced and emerging technologies? And give us some context on why that's important as well.
When we look right now, what's so interesting is we've seen this with the semiconductors making front page news globally. And if you take a step back, it's really about the fact that semiconductors are now enabling these key technologies, kind of driving the future 5G, 6G, quantum computing, machine learning, cloud services. A lot of this then is powered by semiconductors. And what does that enable then in new use cases? I think when we look more broadly at how technology gets applied, it's really also then setting this national agenda in terms of technology investment. What does it mean in terms of our investments in the United States? What's happening on the global market? And so if we look longer term at economic security and overall security, then the role of technology, the role of semiconductors is more front and center than ever. And I think we're seeing that as you can think about the demand even, and obviously all of the supply issues that resulted in this huge uptick in the desire for more semiconductors, more connected devices. And I think we only have to even think of ourselves on this call right now, the amount of connectivity, the amount of compute, the amount of data processing that's occurring is then really challenging globally our need to have this resilient semiconductor industry and making sure that it's tied from a deeper technology basis point.
No, that's great, and obviously not just important for R&D and technological progress, but also for human progress and all of the things that those technologies can empower. Wanted to circle back to something I mentioned in the introduction to the event today on the political and policy climate around enabling some of this development, innovation, and R&D. In your view, is the current administration and Congress doing enough to support our competitive edge and maintain U.S. technology leadership?
Well, I think what we've seen with the CHIPS Plus Sciences Act, that's a great example of a huge, really important step forward. So we really applaud them for all of the work that went into that, all the cooperation, all the long-term planning. But it really is just the beginning. So when we look at how these technologies get applied, I think there's a couple different ways I like to look at it. So one is, as you mentioned, there's the application side of how does it even help us nationally, closing the digital divide, connecting better people to information, whether it's schools, hospitals, or factories. But then when we pivot back to that technology investment, it's incredibly important to have that domestic manufacturing. So the fabs, having more of that in the United States. And obviously that ties hand in hand with how there's investments from the government side. What are the overall incentives to ensure more domestic manufacturing? But that's really only the first step, because we have to really recognize that there is international competition. How are these things incentivized in other countries? And so if we look broadly at what the United States needs to do, it needs to keep driving forward on the path set out here. So it's not just about the semiconductor fabrication, but then really also about the technology research that enables these next generations. We think of even things like workforce development. How can that help make a bigger step forward to making sure we have all of the engineers and scientists and participants in that ecosystem. And so one of the interesting things
Sorry about that, folks. I think we may have just lost John's connection there. Give him a moment to rejoin, and otherwise we'll head over to our panel in just a moment. I think we're getting John back on here in just a moment. Sorry about that. Hey, John, can you hear me? Sorry about this, folks. John will be back on in just a second. Apologies for the delay. Sorry for the delay here, folks. Just give us 1 second. We'll have John back on in just a minute for a final closing thought before we hand it over to our panel. Hey, John, thanks for joining back on here. Sorry for the hiccup there. Wanted to pick up on something that you were saying to get some closing thoughts from you before we hand it over to our panel. As you mentioned, the signing of the Chips and Science Act, big step forward in investing in domestic semiconductor production, obviously an engine of R&D there, and in creating a stronger semiconductor ecosystem in the U.S. to fuel that future growth. You were talking about what needs to happen to really set up this next generation for not just technological innovation, but broader human and societal progress. Wanted to look into that crystal ball with you for a second before we hand it over to the panel. What needs to happen to support U.S. innovation and economic growth in the decades ahead? What's most important from your view in terms of next steps in the future?
Yeah, so that, as we mentioned, so it's incredibly important to have that first big foundational step forward on recognizing the importance of semiconductors, not just on the fab side, but then really on the IP side, on the protection of intellectual property. What does that mean for invention, for enabling new applications, new use cases? So we think of it broadly in terms of economic growth and really connecting more people to more information. So then it's really also then about investing early in that R&D, making sure that it's stuff that's foundational. So we have to really be cognizant of the international landscape and that the United States is continuing to match and indeed better that investment cycle. And then when we look at the role of more technology talent, more people participating in STEM, it's so important for overall participation across society. So we think that further funding of STEM education is also incredibly important. And then just making sure that we're cognizant of the global economic reality of the complex supply chains and how we're not going to solve this strictly alone. We do have to really partner with our key trusted partners and make sure we're bringing that together as a group.
Thank you, John. It's such an important point that you make there, how many diverse pieces there are to the puzzle here. It's innovation, it includes education, it includes infrastructure, it includes obviously policy environment, but so much goes into creating that innovative environment for the future. Thanks again, John, for joining us, and thank you to Qualcomm for the partnership.
Thank you.
Of course. Now we'll move on to our panel. I'm excited to bring up Hirsch Chikara, Protocol Policy Reporter, and our moderator for today's conversation, to introduce our speakers and to get started. Hirsch, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Bennett. I'm honored to moderate today's panel to talk about a topic that I think we would all agree comes at a pivotal moment for policymakers and tech leaders around the world. Our world today feels less stable than it did even a few years ago. And in that time, the tech sector has come to shape even more of our lives, make up even more of the global economy, and grow in its capacity to pose both a greater threat and opportunity for governments. I hope to touch on a few of those topics today. Luckily, we have an extraordinary panel that will help us along the way. So without further ado, I'm going to give a short introduction for each of our panelists, and then we can jump right into questions. Sabine Malik joins us from Thumbtack, where she serves as the head of government affairs and public policy. Sabine previously worked at the State Department, where she served as a senior advisor for tech policy. Professor Chris Miller joins us from the Fletcher School of Global Affairs at Tufts University, where he is an associate professor of international history. Chris has a book coming out next week that I highly recommend, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. Robert Atkinson is the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a leading think tank on science and technology policy. Robert served in the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations working on economic and technology policy. And finally, Jim Green joins us as the head of government affairs at Okta. Jim previously worked on government affairs at Salesforce. So thank you all again for joining us today. I'm really excited for this panel. And I want to start by setting the scene a little bit. So if you had to identify the primary trend that will come to define this moment in global tech development, what would it be? Are we living through the rise of China, the rollback of globalization, the emergence of decentralization and AI, or something else entirely? And I'd love to hear from each of you, but since we have a historian on the panel, I thought maybe it'd be great to start with Chris.
Well, thank you, Hurst, for the introduction and the opportunity to join today. I think you're right to set the technological developments that we're seeing today in the broader global context. And I think one of the things that we've come to assume over the past several decades of a global and largely unified technological landscape is beginning to splinter in ways that even just a couple of years ago might have seemed implausible. We've all become used to ways that the internet is splintered in some ways. Of course, China's Great Firewall being the most example, but the number of new government restrictions on technology transfer and data transfer coming from basically every geography in the world in different ways is really quite striking. Whether you're looking at data localization laws coming in many countries, new data protection regulations that have differential impacts in different geographies, and restrictions on the exports of certain types of computing hardware driven by the United States, as well as some allied countries focused in particular on China. The tech infrastructure is becoming less unified and more divided along national boundaries than ever before. And this is happening for obvious reasons, an increase in geopolitical competition, but the impact on the tech sector is only just beginning to be understood. And so I think that if we want to think about the future of technology and of innovation, which is our goal today, we have to put that next to the regulatory structure, which is promoting more bifurcation and more differentiation along national lines, something that we haven't had to deal with to nearly the same degree in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great thoughts. Sabine, Jim, Rob, what are your thoughts on sort of those defining trends?
Well, I mean, I can jump in. I think the defining trend is, I think we're at the tail end of this older IT transformation or cycle, if you will, which was largely about information. And so my colleague David Moschella has talked about that. If you go back, look at the major Silicon Valley companies in 2000, they're mostly in the information business. They were selling software or, Oracle databases, Microsoft software. If you go and look at Silicon Valley now, it's really in almost every industry now. So you've ag tech, you've got mining tech, you've got smart transportation. So I think what's really going to happen in the next wave is we're going to see IT embedded in many, many more industries. And that's really where the engine is going to be. Certainly the foundation is always going to be semiconductors, as we've heard, and then obviously software and all that and AI. But what I think is going to be different is it's going to be many, many more industries that are IT industries. And that's going to, I think, both broaden and speed up growth.
And oh, sorry, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I kind of agree with that sentiment. I think the reality of it is that this was always looked at historically as its kind of own system where you literally just kind of kept it into a silo. And I look at this conversation more as to what is the raw material under which all of these different aspects of the geopolitical conversation is also happening. Is it the computing power? Is it the resources that you're going to need to build the chips? Is it the fact of the matter that we need some version of folks who are able to understand the underlying technology to be able to then drive it in all these other places? And I don't think we're actually looking at this currently in the way that you framed the question as to, what is it that we actually aren't addressing. I think the reality is we're just at the beginning of understanding why I think political and geopolitical break is happening is because people understand more and more globally the power that exists with this stuff. And I think they're trying to also navigate what has been a historical, you can look at this in multiple different ways, but I think historical context around power and authority and who controls what. So I think there are several aspects here that have to be looked at as to the growth of the actual version of what we talk about tech and where it's going, but then also in terms of the geopolitical aspect of it, I think we're just beginning to understand how you look at sort of the power construct, and that can't be differentiated. And I think these two things will go together to answer your question about what this will look like in the future.
And I would agree with all the previous comments and just add a couple more. Rob talked about how essentially every company now could be seen as a technology company in some respect, or at least the IT of every company from every industry department becomes that much more important. We certainly agree with that sentiment at Okta. And I think part of it will also be, are we seeing digital infrastructure the same way we see physical infrastructure? And are we using appropriate funding on the digital side as well? We think about it from the lens of security. If we all accept the notion that more and more human beings and organizations are going to spend more and more of their time online, which is certainly a trend that we've seen, then we need to have the security within that digital infrastructure. And then another big point that is maybe indirect, but I do think has implications to the geopolitical environment is we need more people to have access in the secure way to their digital life, so that they can understand the trends a little bit faster right now. There's folks in technology who are building every day. I think there's a misalignment between both who has access to the technology and a fundamental understanding of that technology, whether it's the citizen or whether it's the government.
Mm-hmm. And one common thread I heard is about chips and the return of manufacturing and getting sort of shifting from digital to physical. So I want to talk about the return of U.S. manufacturing. It's become a key talking point for midterms and with the passage of the CHIPS Act. But we often talk about a return of American manufacturing when it will, of course, look quite different from anything in the past. So should domestic manufacturing be a policy priority in the U.S.? And if so, what aspects should we focus on? And I wonder if, Robert, you could start. I saw that you recently wrote about this topic and warned that America is on a deindustrialization path similar to the UK. So I'm hoping you can talk about that and talk a bit more about maybe how the dynamics of bringing industrial capacity back to the US is different.
Sure. So there's a lot of confusion about actually where we stand with US manufacturing. And the problem is people who pontificate on that don't really go look at the official government data, which is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the 19 different NAICS codes, and really looking at inflation adjusted value added. Having said that, when you do that, what you find is a very disturbing picture where manufacturing output has grown a little bit, but nowhere near as much as GDP. So in a sense, it's declining. Another big study we did called the Hamilton Index on Advanced Industries, where we looked at 10 different countries and how much advanced manufacturing we each have. Countries like Japan, China, Germany, et cetera, we're below the global average. So I'm very worried about that. And the other challenge here now is that the dollar is pretty much at its highest level ever right now against the pound and the yen and all these other things, other currencies. And that makes US exports more expensive. It makes US imports less expensive. And so I think we're going to take another, I wish I didn't have to say this, but I think we're going to take another hit in manufacturing over the next 2 years. Treasury policy, the whole policy was faulted and flawed, and we've got to figure out a way to bring the dollar down. But yeah, if we don't have manufacturing, we have two big things happen. We hollow out the defense industrial base, and essentially we will not be able to fight a war without dependencies. And secondly, we're just going to keep running giant trade deficits because the majority of our exports are still goods. And if we don't have a manufacturing sector, it means that we'll just run giant trade deficits in perpetuity, or the dollar crashes to maybe 50% of what it is today.
Mm-hmm. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
Well, I could jump in on that, Hirsch. I think the tech and the computing infrastructure sector of the economy is in some ways the brightest story to tell when it comes to advanced manufacturing. On the one hand, if you look at semiconductors, a lot of the fabrication of chips themselves has shifted offshore to places like Taiwan or South Korea. But if you look at the machine tools needed to produce chips, they're largely still produced in the United States in firms based in California. And so although it's easy to tell a simple story, and politicians like to tell the story of the US semiconductor industry completely shifting offshore, the reality is a lot more complex. There certainly is that dynamic partially the case, but there's also the alternate dynamic, which is that some of the most complicated tools and machinery that are in use today are used to produce chips, and those are largely still produced in the United States. So I think, as Rob said, it's a mixed picture when it comes to manufacturing and the tech sector, which ultimately requires our ability to manufacture lots and lots of silicon chips with extraordinary precision, is an example of ways that US manufacturing firms have managed to succeed, not despite globalization, but in fact, because they've been able to tap into global markets.
And what are some of the ways, like when we think about sort of reshoring some of that manufacturing, what are some of the unique ways that the US can compete in the global landscape? I mean, it seems we're not going to compete on labor costs, but what else is there? Is it subsidies like what we saw in the CHIPS Act, or is there something else that can be a key ingredient for bringing back manufacturing?
Well, I think if you look at advanced manufacturing, what you find is that labor costs are actually a small share of what it takes to make equipment. You're looking at the machinery costs, you're often looking at energy costs. It's things besides wages that make up the differential. And so when advanced manufacturing shifts offshore, it's not because there are efficiencies in terms of labor cost differentials. And so I think the US is beginning to, but needs to do more to look at the cost of permitting for new facilities, the ease of setting up new factories, tax treatment, for example, where a lot of other countries, especially in East Asia, probably had very generous investment tax credits, for example, to set up facilities there. And if the tax treatment is far more favorable to manufacture in Taiwan or in South Korea, we shouldn't be surprised to see more advanced manufacturing happening there.
Mm-hmm. And if I could jump in there, it's sort of bizarre in a way when you think about it. It reminds me of the federal government when for a while they were subsidizing tobacco farmers but taxing cigarettes. We have a similar policy with regard to semiconductors. We did CHIPS Act, ITI have huge supporters of, but at the same time, the provision in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2018, I think it was, allowed expensing of equipment investments. So in other words, writing them off in the first year. Chris mentioned a lot of countries actually have investment tax credits, which are even better, but certainly allowing companies to expense their CapEx in the first year is a big incentive for them to do more. And yet Congress is, that provision is due to expire or phase down and then expire at the end of this year. So I think that's number one. We've got to have a tax code that is comparable to what our competitors are doing. Second, and by the way, another component of that is the R&D tax credit. Semiconductors, a lot of other industries, autos invest in a lot in R&D. Study we did recently, we're 32nd out of 34 OECD and BRICS countries in R&D tax credit generosity. In other words, 31 others have more generous credits than we do. I think we've got what we're proposed is a Super CHIPS Act. I know this is sort of one of those things where you'd say it's sort of outside the conventional thinking. It's sort of outside the Overton window. But I think we've got to identify there are going to be a lot of key industries that we have to be able to recruit here. And you go to other countries, they have incentive programs and they're very successful. I think we've got to match that. We've got to do it in partnership with what state governments are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I look at this from the time that I had spent sort of talking to folks that were thinking about investment in the United States generally, but then in some of these areas. And we don't necessarily have, and this is sort of unique to the United States in the way we do sort of this investment discussion, but states and sort of the sort of federal push on generally science investments has been and generally not necessarily lock and sync. And so we've had sort of very strange examples of where specific states will then get out ahead, and then the federal government sort of comes in, and then companies who've come from abroad or investors who've come from abroad are sort of then left with the unknown to sort of say, well, I don't know what kind of risk I'm getting here, and what are you guys actually trying to do in terms of talking about it. So I think the reshoring conversation on the one hand, stats in terms of looking at 350,000 since we've sort of really prioritized this, but what are we bringing back and who's sort of developing sort of a wider range of incentives for that is something that I think we have been, and Rob's kind of looked at the numbers, but anecdotally, we've also not sort of put that as a priority. And I think that, again, the state and the federal sort of dynamic here needs a little bit more discussion around what are we actually thinking about, because, you can put a plant in Ohio, or you can bring people in from different places to live in different cities. But at the same time, if the federal government isn't necessarily prioritizing that too, we have various different regimes that people do have to play by, and investors have to play by. And so it's something we need to look at more closely.
And do you get the sense that there is a bipartisan consensus around the need for reshoring? I mean, I think about the Intel Ohio plant, for instance, and there was a Republican governor who helped develop the subsidy package, and Biden still flew out and gave a speech during the groundbreaking. I know that some of that can be symbolic, but do you sense that there is a fundamental shift in terms of a greater understanding within both parties, the need to prioritize this type of innovation?
I think Rob can speak to that a little bit more because he's sort of seen it up close. But I think, yes, in theory, but I think in practicality, no.
So one of the striking things, as Sabina said, we're in a federalist system. You can go to every governor, no matter how left-wing they are or how right-wing they are, and they all want to attract companies to their state. They all want to grow companies because they have to. They can't run huge budget deficits. They have to actually work for a living, if you will, and get real companies. And so there's this is not a partisan issue at the state level. But somehow when they cross the beltway after they've won their election, they start drinking the Kool-Aid, and the Republicans who formerly thought it was great to do this now think it's bad because it's industrial policy, and the Democrats who thought it was great to do this when they were back in their state think that they should put all the money into social policy. So I do think, though, that we're getting a little bit more. I thought that Intel ribbon cutting was pretty interesting because I could see more ribbon cuttings now, where both parties are part of that, and it's seen as a national thing where we can cut ribbons, whether it's on an LG battery factory or a new semiconductor. I pretty much guarantee you that the next 5 semiconductor plants that open up because of the CHIPS Act, there'll be a ribbon cutting with a high-level federal official.
I would just add to your question, Hirsch, around the bipartisan, and the politics of it. I would say there is growing consensus on reshoring, which could equate to jobs for American workers. I would also say, on the other hand, there may be growing consensus among both parties, but probably more with the Democratic Party at this point around whether or not tax incentives and breaks for corporations are a good thing or not. And I think the delta that we need to account for in that respect is wherever the plant is, are the individuals who live there able to do the jobs that become available? And so I think part of the discussion around politically is showing the art of the possible, that if you do gain these skills, as an example, in my industry, there's 700,000 gap. I think Secretary Raimondo recently said that of cybersecurity professionals in the US alone. That's a pretty big gap. So I think you can both address the politics and the policy if we are reskilling or skilling our workforce in a more scalable way.
I think that's a good transition to talk a bit about specific policies. So in the latest installment of our protocol Brain Trust, we asked for a policy change the US could borrow from another country to boost tech innovation. And I'd love to hear a prescription from each of you. It doesn't necessarily have to be the one policy that would make the highest impact, but maybe something that's underappreciated or not paid as much attention to from another country that you think could be relevant and useful and needs more consideration in the US context. So if anything comes to mind, I'd love to hear, and please feel free to jump in.
Well, I think that the key answer to that question from my perspective is the ability to keep attracting the smartest minds from the world over. And that's something that has been core to US innovation success for the entire history of the United States. And if you look at the semiconductor industry, which I focus on, many of the key innovations in chip technology from the invention of the first chip in the late 1950s forward were done by immigrants. And the reality is that it's gotten harder and harder and more complicated, and more costly and time consuming to bring the workforce that's necessary to the United States. And that incentivizes setting up facilities offshore. So I think the more that we can do to simplify the hiring process for highly talented foreigners, the better off US companies will be, and the easier it will be for them to keep investing in the US.
I'd add, so I agree with those comments. And if you look to other countries right now, I believe actually you guys had some comments earlier today. Canada has a fast track visa program that we could look at. The UK has something similar. And so we do need to keep attracting the top talent from around the world. But I would also say, going back to making sure that our own house is in order, we really need to look at our education system. And I'll just take the liberty. My wife is a school teacher, and I think if people were reading articles at the end of the summer before the school year started, there is a massive dearth of teachers, mostly in public schools, but writ large. And I wonder if we can do something to change that dynamic in the US, and is there somewhere to look abroad that sort of gets education? You often hear stories about how Finland, as an example, does really well in education, a place like Singapore. And is it why is that? And at a certain point, it might be less about policy and more about just what we're valuing here in the US. So I think you need to continue to attract the top talent at the end of the day, whether that's the top talent internationally or making sure that we have the top talent domestically as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with a lot of that. I think I was talking to a Finnish official once who happened to be posted in the US and was so happy her kids were going to public school in Maryland compared to the Finnish schools, because in Finland you get a high math score, but maybe not so high a creative score, if you will. So I do think that we've got to combine the best of America, which is critical thinking and creativity and all. But anyway, I think high school immigration. I mean, there's so many different policies that we should be adopting and learning from our competitors around the world. But one I would propose is other countries, the Germans, the Brits, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, they identify winning in advanced technology as a national mission. So many of them have mission-oriented federal industry partnership laboratories. We don't do that. Our mission is energy. Our mission is health. Our mission is defense. We've never defined winning a commercial technology race as a mission. So I would propose we should try it sort of as a beta test case, copy what Taiwan has done with their ITRI, their Industrial Technology Research Institute. See how it goes. This is an institute that actually played a critical role in Taiwan being a semiconductor leader. So I think that would, to me, would be an out-of-the-box idea that we could certainly try and see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, junk it, get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. And Sabine, does anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's touched a little bit on sort of aspects of what keeps us competitive. But I think, again, to me, the question is, where is the policy derived from? I think we still haven't answered that base question. So to me, it's great to copy other models and to bring it back. But I think this has to be very much an American-driven piece on what keeps us competitive. And so our policy prescriptions also should be based on what works for us here. And I still think it's been difficult, and my observations have been to date that, we, as Rob mentioned, but as others have too, there's a little bit of ambiguity, yet at the same time, we talk about these things tangentially, but we want something created where there's a pipeline. So people from when they're in school all the way to then when they leave school to then when they're looking at their grants. I mean, we have a broken grant model, I think. We don't talk enough about kind of the science ecosystem around that. But, grants to me is something where we just really need to figure out what we want to do with that. There's so much funding that, has historically come from, U.S. U.S. central funding, federal funding, and now we're sort of at the same time watching it erode, and then we sort of are putting it in specific pockets. But I think we really need to think about that kind of level of what we want to do with the monies that follow, and how we sort of follow that ecosystem of sort of where the research is being done, and then how does it get commercialized. We need to continue to do a better job of that.
And on the grant topic, do you get the sense that the dollar isn't going as far as it used to, or that it's becoming a more unwieldy system, or is it?
I think it's several things, but I would just go back to is what is the outcome that people want from the grant making sort of process. I think if you ask scientists, they feel like it's more cumbersome. There's just a lot more sort of actually project management and other skills that, that's not what they started doing, but there's just that much more of what they have to do now to be able to do that. But again, at the same time, we do need to make sure that maybe there is a partnership where we're not putting the scientists in the place where they have to do that, but we're skilling them up and giving them maybe that kind of additional help to be able to then manage the people who are actually doing the research, and then the folks that can make sure that the research dollar then isn't spent somewhere that it wasn't supposed to, or that, we're not getting stuck in a situation where the dollars aren't going where they need to. So I think, again, we need to think creatively about if there are those stumbling blocks, how do we get rid of them? I mean, we could create easily, I think, as much as people have talked about technologists in federal government, I think we can talk about people doing project management in federal government, and other ways that we can help to build that pipeline better, and what are the things that we need to do.
And any reactions to that from the other panelists? Okay, sounds good. I'll move on to another question. I guess over the last few years, the tech company ties to China have been scrutinized more than before. And I recall the big tech congressional hearing from 2020 when Sundar Pichai was questioned over employee backlash against Project Maven, as well as Google's ties to China. And I'm wondering, do you feel that tech leader attitudes are changing when it comes to national allegiance? Should the U.S. government demand tech companies be more explicitly tied to nation? And maybe we can start with Chris on this question.
Yeah, Hirsch, I think we are seeing a shift in that direction, driven, I think, in part by the political process in Washington, but actually more by a major shift in how typical Americans view China. I think if you looked 5 or 10 years ago, especially 10 years ago, views of China were quite favorable. If you polled Americans and asked if they see China as a threat, the answer was generally no. And that's changed pretty dramatically, partially because of the way Xi Jinping consolidated power and crushed his rivals at home, partially because of the actions in Hong Kong and the repressions in Xinjiang, and partially because of China's foreign policy, whether it's the border disputes in the Himalayas on the border with India, or whether it's the buildup of the Chinese military on Taiwan. I think it's become pretty obvious to most Americans that China is increasingly a problem for American national security, and it's a increasingly well-armed problem, such that America's military position has become a lot weaker relative to China. And in that context, I think it's actually not surprising that tech companies that previously wanted to ignore the geopolitical context and could previously get away with it are having to reassess their position. And partly it's because they're being asked to take steps that are more supportive of U.S. security interests, but also partly it's because they're now, for the first time, having to think a bit more critically as to what types of activities are their products being used for in China. Just the number of U.S. firms that have been implicated in supporting in various aspects of the Chinese surveillance state or repressions in Xinjiang is quite large. And I think for a long time, tech executives tried to say, oh, it's not really our fault. China's buying commercial products. We can't control how they're used. Well, that argument is becoming harder to justify. And so, and it's not only the public, it's tech company employees that are demanding higher standards as well. So I would actually say it's not the case that tech companies are feeling pressure to follow Washington's orders. There's a little bit of that, but it's much more that American society overall has really moved dramatically in its assessment of China's role in the world, and and the challenge that China poses to the United States.
So I would have maybe a slightly different view. In foreign policy, I didn't call it a debate, but there's certainly two sides in foreign policy generally. There's the idealist camp, which is sort of the dominant camp, and then there's the realist camp. The idealist camp is that we should, as a country, make interventions that advance certain values around the world and perhaps aren't necessarily in our national self-interest directly. Realist camp is obviously we should do what's good for us. I think we risk running into the idealist camp when it comes to tech policy. It feels good and it sounds good to cut off certain exports to China if they're being used for other purposes. The realist camp would say, well, if we don't sell them stuff, aren't the Koreans going to sell them that? Aren't the Japanese going to sell them that? Aren't the Chinese going to build up their own domestic industry to supply that? So, look, I understand the emotion behind it. I understand how important the issue is. But at the end of the day, we need to be approaching China with a pretty narrow, specific lens. How do we hurt them and how do we help ourselves? That should be the real debate here. And what I worry about, you've heard people actually say that we should cut off chip exports to China, not like super advanced chips, but chips. Why would we want to do that? By doing that, we would, number one, empower our competitors of Korea, other countries. Number two, we would encourage the Chinese to get self-sufficient even more. And number three, we would reduce our own revenues that we could reinvest there. So I think we're going to have to essentially look at the world in a kind of bifurcated way. The old way that Washington looked at the world was, hey, we're all moving to this nirvana globalist world, the Tom Friedman kind of world, no borders, no state. Who cares about the state? Yeah, I think we need to start caring about the state. But that really is only about Russia, China, and a couple of rogue states. So the rest of the world, I think we can kind of keep that fundamentally good globalist view. American companies want to invest there, great. If foreign companies want to invest here, great. But when it comes to China, I think we have to have a different orientation. And again, I go back to this notion of we have to thinking about aligning state interests with corporate interests. We saw that the other day when Apple announced a big push for the 14 or whatever their phone is, making it in India. That's a big step, and I commend Apple for doing that. I think companies are going to get more pressure to do things like that as we go forward. But we got to make sure that it is fundamentally in our interest and against China's interest, not something that just sounds good.
And any other thoughts on that before?
Yeah, I would just, one thing to add, I think when thinking about what are the types of technologies that one can plausibly control versus what are the types of technologies that one can't control to kind of fit into the framework that Rob set out. There are a lot of technologies that are produced by multiple companies in multiple countries around the world. And those types of technologies, you can control your firms, but as Rob said, you can't control firms in other countries. There are a smaller selection of technologies where the US either has a complete monopoly over their production or the US and a couple of close allies do. And those are the technologies where we've seen a lot of movement from the US over the past couple of years in imposing stricter controls, because in many cases, there are types of technologies where China is so far behind and where the cost of catching up is so large or improbable, China's not going to in any sort of foreseeable time horizon. And so actually digging into specific technology sets and the equipment involved and the cost of making it and the types of specialized knowledge needed to produce it is really crucial in figuring out which types of technology can you plausibly control and which types are just impossible to control. And if you try to control it, you'll end up hurting your own firms.
Or if I could just quickly say to Chris, or we could control them if we get partnerships with our allies, which we saw with the Russian, with 31 countries, I believe, work together. So I'm all for that. I just don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot and when other countries are taking advantage of that.
I'd just like to add from the vantage point that, there is a science and technology effort in our foreign policy. We have S&T agreements with lots of countries, and we've historically had it for a very long time, over 50 years in some cases. And, the ethos of scientists, and again, I come back to this idea that we talk a lot about tech, but then we talk about science and then we talk about innovation, and each of these things are built on each other. But then when we talk about technology, people have very specific things they have in mind. But I just want to go back to the idea of, how information is shared, regardless of whether it's digital information or scientific discoveries. And the US for a long time has had these partnerships, and folks have talked about the sharing of science and what are the sort of standards that need to be in place and how do we do this better so that there isn't this kind of espionage or other aspects to it that feel very seedy, and then countries who are actually engaging in it, we don't really know what to do with them. But I think reality, again, about what is it that we're doing in terms of developing those partnerships, with whom are we actually enforcing the kind of level of scrutiny that we want to have, and are we using the forums that we already have to have these discussions well? And I don't think we historically have. I think a lot of these discussions kind of live in very specific areas. People don't really necessarily put and connect the dots in terms of the type of discussions that they're having. And then they become something that, all of a sudden, if it becomes politicized, then only then does it raise to the level of that discussion. But these science communities and these technology communities have been talking about sharing what are the norms around them for a very long time. And I think, again, if we want to go back to things that where these communities actually live and where they talk about and what they want to do, we should go back and look at those things and then update it according to what we think global norms are and what's acceptable and what's not. But I don't think we've done it. I think we've kind of let them just sort of live on their own and sort of wither away. And we don't really talk to the folks that are, I think, closest to the issues at hand until and then they either become geopolitical issues or we're not really listening to the folks that have been sort of, I think, yelling for a very long time about these issues. And on the investment side, again, folks have been pointing this out in terms of investment, where it's going, who are the investors, what are their aims and what are their goals. I just think, again, sometimes that noise is not calibrated and is not brought to the fore of where actionable stuff can happen. Up until then, it becomes a political priority. And why do we have to wait until that? I think is a more deep question we have to answer.
Mm-hmm. And I guess when you mention and we talk about like the U.S. working with allies in order to forward, in order to sort of decide where technology should be sold or who it's okay to sell to, is there a risk that the U.S. maybe erodes its authority to work with allies in that capacity if it asks more and more of them, or do you see it as having a strong positioning to still do so?
Well, Chris, did you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think, Washington lives in a world that is not up to date when it comes. Most of the people in Washington are doing foreign policy grew up when we were the hegemon. We were dominant. We were dominant economically, militarily, and from a foreign policy perspective. And so we could afford to do things unilaterally. And other countries more or less had to go along with it. Those days don't exist anymore. So I think, Hirsch, even the way you framed the question, I think is not really that's sort of the way we used to frame it. These countries are going to get irked with us. I think the way we need to frame it is we are all in the same boat together. Chinese economic and technology predation is actually going to be worse for Europe, according to the, I think it's the Mercatus study in Germany. It's going to be worse for them than it's going to be worse for us. Japan knows how bad it's going to be for them. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to really work more carefully with our allies to understand, help everybody understand we're all in the same boat. We're all dealing with the same challenge from China. And if you think you can, I was always one meeting in Europe once, it always struck me. It was I was making this point, and one of the European officials said, well, we don't really worry about that because we figure once China takes you guys down, we'll be the lead. Yeah, that's not going to happen. And I think the Europeans know that's not going to happen anymore, that we have to work together. So I think that's the next big challenge. Can we operationalize some of these things? Problem right now is the Biden administration is doing a lot that I think is quite positive. The TTC, the IPAF, the Indo-Pacific arrangement, all to the good. But I think we've got to figure out a way to coordinate it and step it up another level.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I think one of the challenges is that right now we're working in the context of a multilateral system that's proven unable to deal with the major issues that it faces. We've got a huge swath of subsidies coming from the Chinese government across a range of technologies that have been visible and widely tracked the last decade. and yet no one has any idea what to do about them. And the WTO has proven incapable of dealing with the issue. And there's no effective means of pressuring China to stop them that has been found. And so, so long as that's the case, we've got multilateral institutions that can't deal with the problem. There will be a kind of dilemma at the core of the global trading system. And there's agreement, as Rob alluded to, between the US and Japan and other countries as to the nature of the problem, but no one has got a solution that preserves the rest of the trading framework intact.
Mm-hmm. And then moving into our final few questions, we've spoken a lot about international competition as it pertains to technology sectors, but I want to talk about whether economic concentration impacts innovation, whether antitrust is a remedy. And then on the flip side, there's the argument that there's been sort of a growing movement saying that antitrust would hurt our national security and our inability to compete against China. I'm hoping to get your thoughts on that and sort of how we navigate the sort of domestic considerations for scale and competition with some of that international competition element.
So if I could jump in, I've actually done a lot of work on that. My colleague Michael Lind and I wrote a book for MIT Press called Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. And one of the challenges with this debate is it's based upon two fundamental, I think, intellectual errors. One is that concentration has been going up. It really hasn't. We did an analysis of the most recent census data looking at around 876-digit industry codes. So very, the tortilla production industry, very refined industry codes. And when you look at that, what you find is essentially almost no increase in concentration from 2002 to 2017, just the most de minimis. And the most concentrated industries in 2002, on average, became less concentrated by 2017. So I think a lot of it is not to say that there aren't some individual industries, not to say that every merger should go through. A lot of this is a ginned up thing that the quote neo-Brandeisians want to advance because they want to advance an anti-big business agenda, in my opinion. But Hirsch, your point is also an important one. It's also about scale. So there's a lot of good evidence, particularly by Phil Aghion, a French economist, this notion of an inverted U and the relation between competition and innovation. So if you have too much competition, you don't have innovation. Think about the dry cleaning industry. That it doesn't make enough profits to invest in anything. So you have to have enough what people call Schumpeterian profits to invest in the next generation. What you don't want firms that make those profits and just rent seek you want firms that make extra profits but pour them back. And that really is the tech industry, because any technology firm, we heard from Qualcomm earlier, but you take any technology firm that didn't work like the Dickens to get the next generation of technology is a firm we're not going to know anything about in 10 years. So there's this inverted U. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. I think in general, we're kind of in the right place. And then the last component is China's strategy. You can criticize it or not. China's strategy is essentially to create big, humongous firms that can have global scale. So we've seen that over and over again. We've seen it in high-speed rail with they merged two big state-owned enterprises for their high-speed rail industry. They understand that scale is sort of one of the most important things you need in global markets. And on top of that, they get scale and they get government subsidies, as Chris alluded to. So if we take away scale of our companies, we're never going to give anywhere near the subsidies that the Chinese do. We need to have companies that are big enough to go out and fight those battles. So again, it's this fine line. You don't want lazy monopolists, which I don't think we have, but at the same time, advancing the current FTC antitrust agenda, I think would be a huge mistake, because it would balkanize our companies and make them too weak to go out and fight those fights.
And Jim and Sabine, what are your thoughts working with an industry in companies that are not the biggest of the tech companies?
I'll start. I would say I would look at it through the lens of this conversation and the lens of innovation, right? So how do you create the best conditions for the best innovation? So in earlier questions, we talked about access to talent, access to capital. et cetera. And you constantly need to nurture that. I do think it's a fair question to ask, is competition and antitrust a way to create more innovation or less? Rob did a good job of talking about both sides of that from a scale perspective as it relates to competition between the US and China. I think those are fair points. I do think it's also fair to look at whether or not the conditions are ripe for innovation to flourish, or are they being diminished? And there are a couple of ways to look at that, but I think more and more companies are looking for ways to interoperate with different products and services, and to do that in a secure way. And so part of that would be developing common technical standards that wouldn't degrade security in any way. But I would answer that question, how are you continuing to make sure you have the conditions for innovation? And looking at antitrust, which is obviously being looked at in the US and in Europe right now, is a fair question to ask.
Sabine and Chris, any final thoughts on this topic?
I think it's a tool, just like we have other legal regimes that help to kind of, again, think about what is it that a landscape looks like that's a healthy environment. But overutilization of something, again, doesn't lead to necessarily the right outcome. I think in many ways, there's specific industries that maybe necessarily have some of this tied up, maybe have some issues that some of the competition law folks should look at. But I don't think you can generalize. And I think, again, this notion that somehow it is the hammer that this should be used for everything, I think is something that we need to talk about geopolitically as to why all of a sudden it's become kind of the discussion du jour. But then also think about more about what does it actually look like then to use it in a way that, again, creates that innovation ecosystem that we've felt like has thrived and let a lot of these companies do the things that they need to do. So it's a more nuanced conversation. I don't think that it can just be in sound bites. And it sounds like, one of the discussions around what's kind of been happening in the EU and then floating into the United States, I do think is a little bit problematic. I think, again, we need to have a US version of what is happening here and what our realities are, and shouldn't just look for sort of simple solutions just because they're imported somewhere and someone else has done the work.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, final thoughts?
Well, I think I agree with all that. And if you think of the industries in the economy where there's the most stagnation and the most sclerosis and a couple of big firms dominating, tech is not that industry. Most tech firms that I use on a regular basis didn't exist when I was a teenager. And so I struggle to see the argument that we're suffering from a lack of competition in the tech sector, given that most of the companies that we're thinking about are just a decade or two old. That's not evidence of an industry suffering from a deficit of competition. That's an example of competition and innovation happening all around us.
Great. Well, thank you all again for this discussion. I think it's been really wonderful. I know we could talk for a few more hours, but I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too.
Thank you so